She stepped off that train wearing a dress 2 seasons out of fashion, carrying one suitcase held shut with a piece of rope, and every single person on that platform looked at her like she was a mistake somebody had mailed to the wrong address. Elias Hawthorne stood at the edge of the crowd, hat in hand, and felt his stomach drop straight through the dirt. This was his wife, the woman he'd agreed to marry without ever laying eyes on. The woman his ranch hands were already snickering about behind cupped hands. The woman who looked up at him with calm, tired eyes, not desperate, not ashamed, and said simply, "Mr. Hawthorne, I hope I haven't kept you waiting long." He had no idea, standing in that dust and afternoon heat, that she was about to save everything he'd spent his life building. And he had no idea how close he would come to destroying her first. Boss. Awesome. If this story already has you hooked, stay until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday, which Elias Hawthorne later decided was fitting because Tuesdays had always been his worst day of the week. He'd been out by the eastern fence line when his foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Cobb Rafferty, rode out to hand him the folded paper without a word. Cobb had a talent for delivering news the same way you'd hand someone a snake, extended at arm's length, face turned slightly away, as if he wanted no part of whatever came next. Elias read the telegram twice standing there in the brown grass with the October wind pulling at his coat. Arrangements confirmed. Stop Miss Hannah Whitlock, departs Columbus, Ohio, Friday. Stop arrives Millhaven Station, November 4th. Stop morning, train, stop. He folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket. That the one? Cobb asked. That's the one. Cobb said nothing for a moment. He squinted out at the flat horizon the way men do when they're choosing their words. You nervous? Elias looked at the fence post he'd been about to repair. There was a split running up the grain. Not bad yet, but getting there. Give it one hard winter and it would crack clean through. Get back to work, Cobb, he said. Yet, Hawthorne Ranch sat 11 miles southeast of Millhaven, a town that wasn't much to speak of even by frontier standards. A feed store, a bank, a church, 2 saloons, and a hotel that smelled permanently of pipe smoke and boiled cabbage. The ranch itself covered nearly 400 acres, running cattle on the southern pastures and horses on the northern ones, with a creek that never fully dried up even in August, which was the only reason Elias's father had originally bought the land. His father, Thomas Hawthorne, had built the main house with his own hands before his back gave out. It was a solid house, 2 stories, a covered porch running the full length of the front. Once it had been kept up. Once there had been curtains in the windows, and a kitchen garden along the south wall, and a woman's touch evident in 100 small ways that Elias could no longer quite remember individually, only feel the absence of. His mother had died when Elias was 14. His father had held on another 6 years before the land took him too. For the last 8 years, Elias had run the ranch alone. Not alone in the literal sense, he employed 6 ranch hands, including Cobb, and a rotating collection of seasonal workers, but alone in the way that matters, which is the way of a man who comes home to a house where nothing has moved since morning. He was 39 years old, and he had not meant to become that particular kind of man. It had simply happened the way most quiet disasters happen, gradually and then all at once. The decision to pursue a frontier marriage had not been romantic. He wouldn't pretend otherwise. It had come from a conversation with his neighbor, Walt Greer, whose own arranged match 3 years prior had turned out well enough that Walt had stopped drinking and started laughing again, which counted for a great deal. Elias had watched the change in Walt with something he only recognized later as longing. He'd contacted a respectable agency in Columbus. He'd answered their questionnaire honestly, or as honestly as a man can when he's describing himself to strangers, which means he'd been honest about his land and his cattle and his financial situation, and considerably less forthcoming about the fact that he worked 18-hour days and had no idea how to talk to a woman anymore, and sometimes stood in his kitchen at night not eating anything because cooking for one felt like a punishment he couldn't name. Hannah Whitlock had been the agency's recommendation. Her file had been brief. 31 years old. No living parents. Had cared for 3 younger siblings through their childhoods. Seen them all established. Some experience in domestic management, which was the agency's polished way of saying she'd been running a household since before she was old enough to vote. References from a minister and a school teacher in her community, both of whom described her as capable and steady, and one of them, the school teacher, had written, "You would be fortunate to have her," which stood out to Elias because it was the only part of the document that sounded like something a real person had actually meant. There had been no photograph. He had told himself it didn't matter. What? November 4th arrived cold and gray, the sky the color of old tin, and Elias drove the wagon into Mill Haven with his hat pulled low and his jaw set in an expression that Cobb, who had insisted on accompanying him, recognized as Elias trying not to show anything. Half the town seemed to have found reasons to be near the station that morning. This was the Frontier's version of theater, and Elias was providing the main attraction. A bachelor rancher receiving a mail-order bride was exactly the kind of event that could sustain conversation through an entire winter, and Millhaven was not a town that let such opportunities pass. He recognized faces. The Delaney sisters, who ran the dry goods store and were the primary distribution network for local gossip. Judge Prentice and his wife, who didn't need an excuse to be anywhere since the judge considered himself a fixture of all significant community events. Roy Fitch from the bank, who had no business being there whatsoever but was there regardless. Elias stood with his arms crossed and said nothing to any of them. The train was 12 minutes late. Those 12 minutes were among the longer 12 minutes of his life. He heard it before he saw it. The distant complaint of the whistle, then the growing percussion of the engine, then the whole mechanical drama of the thing slowing and hissing and shuddering to a stop, releasing great clouds of steam that drifted across the platform and briefly made it hard to see. People disembarked. A drummer with sample cases. A young family, the mother struggling with a baby and two small children. An older man in a minister's collar. 3 men who looked like they were connected to cattle in some professional capacity. And then, toward the end, a woman stepped down onto the platform alone. She was not what anyone had been picturing. Elias could feel it. The shift in the crowd's attention, the pause, the reassessment. He was reassessing too, and hated himself for doing it at the same time he couldn't stop. She was of medium height and slight build, wearing a dark blue dress that had been pressed carefully but was cut in a style that had been fashionable some years ago. Her hair was brown, pulled back simply. Her face was... She was not plain, exactly. That wasn't the right word, though he suspected it was the word other people were already reaching for. She had good bones and a composed expression and eyes that, from across the platform, he couldn't yet make out the color of. What struck him most was not her appearance, but her manner. She stood on the platform holding a battered suitcase, one suitcase, small, with a length of rope knotted around it as a secondary latch. And she looked around the station with a steadiness that seemed deliberate. Not confidence exactly, more like someone who had made a decision and had finished second-guessing it. Their eyes met. She walked toward him directly. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, and extended her free hand. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting long." Her handshake was firm, her voice was even. Up close, her eyes were a dark amber brown, and there were shadows under them that spoke of a long journey, and probably, he thought, longer years before it. "Train was late," he said. "Not your doing." She nodded once as if that settled something. Behind him, he heard Cobb murmur something to himself. He didn't catch the words, but he caught the tone, and it tightened something in his chest. The ride out to the ranch took the better part of an hour on good roads, and these were not particularly good roads. Elias drove, and Hannah sat beside him on the wagon seat with her suitcase at her feet, and the silence between them was the particular kind that two strangers produce when neither of them knows yet what kind of silence it will eventually become. She asked questions, which he hadn't expected, practical ones. "How many men on the ranch?" "6 regular hands, sometimes more in season." "Do they take their meals in a bunkhouse or the main house?" "Main house, usually. Kitchen's big enough." "What's the water situation? I noticed the creek on your land deed." He looked at her sideways. "You read the land deed?" "The agency sent a copy with the file." She said it matter-of-factly. "I like to know what I'm walking into." He turned back to the road. "Creek runs year-round. Well behind the house for closer use." "Garden space?" "South wall. Used to be a kitchen garden. Let it go." She nodded, looking out at the passing land. He couldn't tell if she was judging it or simply cataloging it. It's bigger than I imagined, she said. Not admiringly, exactly, just observationally. Is that good or bad? She considered this with apparent seriousness. More work, she said, but more to work with. I'll reserve judgment. He almost smiled. He didn't, but it was close. The hands were gathered near the barn when the wagon pulled in, because of course they were. Elias had not told them to make themselves scarce, partly because it wouldn't have worked, and partly because some stubborn part of him felt that any deliberate performance of welcome would ring false. He preferred reality, even when reality was uncomfortable. There were 6 of them. Cobb, who had ridden back ahead. Pete Dunbar, who was young and didn't yet know when to keep his expression neutral. The Garza brothers, Miguel and Tomas, who were generally decent men. Old Herschel Vane, who had worked the land longer than most of them had been alive. And Jimmy Flatt, who was handsome and knew it, and considered this a kind of accomplishment. They looked at Hannah the way men look when they've been expecting something and gotten something else. Elias set the brake and climbed down, then turned to offer Hannah a hand. She took it without hesitation and stepped down cleanly. "This is Miss Whitlock," Elias said. "She'll be running the house. You'll show her the same respect you show me, and if that's too much to ask, you can take that conversation somewhere private." He said it quietly, which was how he said most things. But there was something in the quietness that generally communicated clearly enough. The men removed their hats, mumbled greetings. Hannah looked at each of them and nodded, not smiling, not stiff, just present. It was Pete Dunbar who ruined it, though ruined was perhaps too strong a word. He didn't say anything out loud. He just nudged Jimmy Flatt with his elbow, and Jimmy Flatt pressed his lips together in a way that was just barely not a laugh, and Hannah saw it. Elias saw her see it. Her expression didn't change. That was the thing that would stay with him later, turning over in his mind like a stone you keep picking up to look at the underside of. Her expression didn't change. She just filed the information away somewhere behind those amber eyes and said, "Pleased to meet you all," and picked up her own suitcase before Elias could reach for it. Chapter 2. The house embarrassed him. He hadn't let himself think about it much until she was standing in it, and then he saw it through new eyes, which were not kind. The kitchen had a layer of grease accumulated on the surface above the stove that had been there long enough to become a kind of geological record. The curtainless windows, the sitting room that held only a chair and a table because furniture cost money, and he'd never quite found the moment to prioritize it. The hallway where the wallpaper had started peeling at the corner, and he'd been meaning to do something about that for approximately 3 years. He showed her the house quickly, the way you move through embarrassment, with speed and minimal commentary. She walked through each room without comment, but he watched her eyes moving, cataloging again. The kitchen she stood in for a full minute, turning slowly, and he thought he saw something happen in her face. Not disgust, not despair. Something more like a person surveying a problem and beginning to solve it. "The bedroom upstairs," he said at the top of the stairs. I put clean linens on." He'd done this himself that morning, badly. The corners not tucked right, and for some reason this bothered him more than the wallpaper. "Thank you," she said, and went in and set her suitcase on the chair by the window. He hovered in the doorway like a man who wasn't sure of the rules of his own house, which was accurate. "I can have Cobb move whatever you need," he said. "Extra furniture, whatever." "I don't need much," she said. She was already untying the rope from her suitcase. Her hands were efficient, no wasted motion. "Mr. Hawthorne." "Elias." She glanced up at that. "Elias, I want to be straightforward with you." "All right. I know what kind of arrangement this is. I'm not expecting poetry. I'm not expecting anything dramatic." She opened the suitcase. It contained, he noted, a modest collection of clothing, some books, a wooden box he assumed held small personal items. "I can cook and manage a household, and I'm willing to work. That's what I'm here to offer. If you're willing to deal honestly with me about what this place needs and what you expect, I think we'll get along fine." He stood in the doorway. Outside, the wind was moving through the grass, the way it always did out here, constant and indifferent. "That's a fair offer," he said. "Good." She set a dress on the chair back and didn't look at him again, which he understood as a dismissal. Not a rude one, just the dismissal of someone who had things to do. He went back downstairs and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the accumulated grease above the stove and feeling something he couldn't immediately name. It took him a minute to identify it as shame. She found the kitchen at 5 the next morning. He knew this because he was always up at 5, and when he came downstairs from a sleep that had been restless in the specific way of a man aware of another person's presence in his house, the kitchen lamp was already lit, and there was a woman standing at his stove examining it with her arms crossed and an expression of focused displeasure directed entirely at the appliance. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." She didn't look up. "This flue is partially blocked. Do you know when it was last cleaned?" He thought about it. "Maybe 2 years." She absorbed this without visible reaction, which he was beginning to understand was her mode of receiving bad news. "I'll need a brush and someone to go up on the roof. The draft's wrong. It'll smoke up the kitchen when I get this going properly. I can send Pete up, after breakfast." She had already moved to the pantry and was looking at his stores with the expression she'd apparently reserved for disappointing situations. "You have salt pork, cornmeal, dried beans, some flour that's seen better days." She lifted the flour sack, pinched a bit, rubbed it between her fingers. "It's usable. Barely." She put it down. "Do you have eggs?" "Chickens are out back, usually 4 or 5 eggs in the morning." "Coffee?" "On the shelf." She found it, examined it. "This'll do." She turned and for the first time that morning looked at him directly, and there was something almost businesslike in her gaze, not unfriendly but not making any concessions to the strangeness of their situation. "How many men for breakfast?" "7, counting me." She nodded and turned back to the stove. "Give me an hour and a half." He poured himself a cup of yesterday's leftover coffee, cold, and sat at the kitchen table and watched her work. He told himself he was just waiting for the ranch day to start. He sat there for 40 minutes. The eggs she scrambled with something. He wasn't sure what she added, something from the small wooden box she'd brought downstairs, some dried herb or spice. He couldn't identify it, but they came out differently than eggs ever came out in his kitchen. She had found a heel of cured ham at the back of the larder that he'd forgotten about and sliced it thin and crisped it in the pan, and she'd made cornbread in the iron skillet, and it had a crust on the bottom that was exactly the right amount of browned. The men came in for breakfast in their usual way, which was to say loud and unaware of themselves, and they sat at the long table, and Hannah put the food in front of them without ceremony and poured coffee and stood back near the stove. Silence fell. Not the silence of men ignoring food, the silence of men paying attention to it. Pete Dunbar looked up first. He had the decency to look slightly confused, as if the eggs had wronged him in some way he couldn't articulate. "This is," he started. "Good," said Herschel Vane flatly, because Herschel never used 2 words when one would serve. He was already reaching for the cornbread. Jimmy Flatt, who had been one of the elbow nudgers the day before, was quiet in a different way than usual. He ate with a kind of focus that he typically reserved for work he considered important. He didn't look at Hannah. He didn't look at anyone. He just ate. Elias watched all of this from his end of the table. Hannah had made herself a small plate and stood at the kitchen counter eating apart from them, which struck him as the natural choice of a woman who understood her position in a household she had not yet earned. Not subservient, just practical. Cobb caught Elias's eye across the table and lifted his chin slightly. A question, or maybe an acknowledgement. Elias looked away. After the meal, the men filed out. Some of them, he noticed, muttered something in the direction of the kitchen as they left. He didn't catch all of it, but he heard "good breakfast" from Miguel Garza, said quietly to the floor, and "thank you, ma'am," from old Herschel, who hadn't said thank you for a meal in living memory. He was the last one out. He stopped at the kitchen door. Hannah was already at the sink, sleeves pushed to her elbows, washing up. "Breakfast was good," he said. She didn't stop washing. "I need to get into town for supplies sometime this week. I made a list. I'll have Cobb take you Thursday." "Thank you." A pause. "The flu." "Pete'll go up after lunch." She nodded. He left. He walked out to the barn trying to figure out why the conversation had felt so much like something other than a conversation. Like the beginning of a negotiation, maybe. Or the very first sentences of something much longer. Chapter 3. By the end of the first week, small things had changed. Not dramatically. Nothing was transformed or miraculous, but the changes were there if you were paying attention, which Elias was, though he would not have said so out loud. The curtains appeared in the kitchen window first. He didn't know where she'd gotten the fabric, probably cut something up, or found something in a trunk. They were plain, unbleached cotton, not fancy, but they were there, and they changed the light in the morning in a way that was difficult to describe and easy to feel. The peeling wallpaper in the hallway had been stuck back with something. It wasn't invisible, the repair, but it had stopped the peeling from spreading further. The south wall garden had been turned. Just turned, the ground broken up, the weeds pulled. Nothing planted yet, the season being wrong for it, but the bed was ready. Elias noticed these things and said nothing, partly because he didn't know how to talk about them, and partly because mentioning small things sometimes embarrassed the person responsible, and he didn't want to do that. He was less successful at managing his ranch hands. The snickering had not entirely stopped. It had just moved from out in the open to the bunkhouse at night, to the corners of the barn, to exchanges that went quiet when he came near. He was not unaware of it. He simply had not yet decided what to do about it. Pete Dunbar was the worst, or at least the least subtle. Pete was 22 and had a young man's certainty that his opinions were both important and amusing. One afternoon, coming back from the east pasture, Elias passed close enough to the barn to hear Pete talking to Jimmy Flatt. Thought a man with his land could have done better than that. He didn't hear the rest because he kept walking. He told himself this was because he had work to do, which was true. He told himself it was because Pete was young, and young men said stupid things, which was also true. He did not tell himself the part where some small, dishonorable corner of his own chest had registered the remark and failed to argue with it immediately, which was the truest thing. No, Hannah had not been in town more than 30 minutes before she knew what the town thought of her. She had gone Thursday with Cobb, as arranged, to the feed store and general supply for the items on her list. Millhaven was not a large town and therefore operated at a social density that made privacy essentially impossible. Martha Delaney, older of the Delaney sisters, operated the dry goods counter, had been pleasant in the way of someone being pleasant as a performance. She'd ask questions that were packaged as friendly interest, but were really just retrieval operations. How are you finding the frontier? Is the ranch what you expected? How is Mr. Hawthorne treating you? That last one delivered with a particular inflection, a slight widening of the eyes, that made it clear the question was really, is he disappointed? Hannah answered all of it simply and without volunteering anything, which frustrated Martha Delaney considerably. The real moment had come at the counter of the feed store, where two women Hannah didn't know had stopped talking too quickly when she approached. One of them recovered well. The other one, younger, had not been able to suppress a certain expression, the one that meant, so that's her. Hannah bought what was on her list. She thanked the men at the counter. She was courteous to everyone she encountered. Riding back in the wagon, she looked at the flat open land and said nothing. Cobb drove and also said nothing, which she appreciated. He was a man who seemed to understand that silence was sometimes the only decent thing on offer. After a while, he said, "Town takes some getting used to." "I've been in small towns before," she said. He was quiet again. Then, "They'll come around." "Maybe." She looked at her hands in her lap. The skin was rough, not gentled, already red at the knuckles from the cleaning she'd been doing. "It doesn't much matter if they do or don't, Mr. Rafferty. I'm not here for the town." Cobb looked at her sideways in a way that reminded her, briefly, of the way Elias did, like something she'd said had given him something to think about. They drove the rest of the way in a silence that was companionable enough. The night she made the beef stew was the night things shifted. Not suddenly, not completely, but shifted in the way of a load redistributing itself on a wagon. You don't notice the moment of change. You just notice later that the balance is different. She had found a good cut of beef in the cold store, better than she'd expected, actually, which told her that Elias spent money on quality ingredients, even if the kitchen itself had been allowed to decline. She'd browned the meat first, properly, let it get a real crust before adding the liquid, and she'd used the herbs from her box, rosemary, thyme, a little dried bay, and let the whole thing cook slow for the better part of the afternoon, the smell of it spreading through the house, and then, because the kitchen window was open against the unusual warmth of the afternoon, spreading further. She'd made biscuits, too. Fresh ones, properly layered. Dinner was at 6. The men came in at their usual noise level and then quieted in the way she was starting to understand meant the smell had reached them and something had shifted in their priorities. Nobody said much while eating. Then Jimmy Flatt put down his spoon. "Ma'am," he said. She looked up. Jimmy Flatt had good looks and the easy confidence that came with them, and he'd been the one she'd marked earliest as trouble. Not malicious, just careless, the kind of man who said things without thinking about the weight of them. "Yeah," he said, and shook his head slightly, as if he was responding to an argument no one else had heard. "This is the best thing I've eaten since my mother's kitchen." It was not an apology. He hadn't done anything specifically that required one, or not that she was willing to call out directly. But it was something. A man who'd been dismissive being, however awkwardly, honest about being wrong. She recognized the effort it took. "I'm glad you're enjoying it," she said, and meant it. Across the table she saw Elias watching Jimmy with an unreadable expression. Then he looked at her, and she looked back, and something passed between them that wasn't communication exactly, but was something in that neighborhood. He dropped his eyes to his bowl. She did the same. Chapter 4. There are domestic skills and there are survival skills, and in the right circumstances, they are the same skill. By her third week at Hawthorne Ranch, Hannah had made the following changes. Reorganized the kitchen stores by category and frequency of use, which cut her prep time significantly. Identified a slow leak in the cold store that had been causing spoilage and had Pete fix it. Planted garlic along the south wall garden, it being the right season. Found a box of her mother-in-law's canning supplies in the far corner of the cellar and begun using them, and repaired a chair in the sitting room that had a wobbly leg by resetting the joint with glue she'd made from hide scraps. None of these things were extraordinary, but they accumulated. Herschel Vane, who had been on the ranch longer than anyone except the land itself, started appearing in the kitchen doorway in the late afternoons. Not to talk especially, just to sit on the stool near the door and occupy the space. Hannah had the impression he was doing this for company. Not her company specifically, at first, just the company of a lit lamp and someone moving around with purpose. She didn't mind. She started talking to him sometimes. Just practically. "Have you seen where he put the extra lamp oil? Or what's the weather usually like here in November?" He answered briefly and accurately, and she filed the information, and occasionally he would offer something unrequested, like winter's harder out on the east pasture. That wind comes straight down off the mountains, or the soil along the south wall is clay-heavy. You'll need to break it up before spring. She listened to all of it. She noticed that he was watching her, in the peripheral way old men watch things they're trying to evaluate, not intrusively, just attentively, deciding something about her. The night he said, "You know what you're doing, don't you?" she almost said something modest and then decided not to. "Yes," she said simply. He nodded once, like something had been confirmed, and got up and went to bed. The Sunday 2 weeks into her arrival, Elias found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, which was simply sitting. Not working, not planning. Just sitting on the porch in the late afternoon with a cup of coffee that had gone cold without him noticing, looking out at the land and not finding the silence oppressive. That was the thing. The silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of a house with someone in it. The specific quality of sounds from the kitchen filtering through the door. Someone moving with purpose. The smell of the evening meal beginning to build. He hadn't known, until its contrast was present, how loud the previous silence had actually been. He thought about his conversation, if it could be called that, with Walt Greer 3 years ago. Walt had said something that had sounded absurd at the time. He'd said, "It's not what you think. It's not about the company. It's about the living. Somebody else is living with you. Your life is more alive." He'd thought Walt had gone soft. He poured the cold coffee off the porch railing and went inside. Hannah was at the stove. She had an apron on. She'd sewn it herself from flour sacks, he'd noticed, because there wasn't one in the kitchen. And her hair was coming loose at the back from the pins she put in it every morning. And she was doing something complicated with the pot that involved a great deal of confident action and no particular concern about whether anyone was watching. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. She turned, not startled, just present. "All right." He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hands at his sides. "Some of the men, in the first couple of days, they said things they shouldn't have. I didn't—" He stopped, started again. I didn't address it the way I should have. She was quiet for a moment. She turned back to the pot and adjusted something. I know, she said. I saw. I know you did. He looked at the floor. I'm telling you I'm addressing it now. She was quiet again, stirring. Is this the apology, or is there a separate apology coming? It was so direct, delivered so matter-of-factly, that he almost laughed. He did not. Bit of both, I suppose, he said. She glanced at him over her shoulder. There was something in her eyes that might have been wry if you were being generous. Then I'll accept them both, she said. Now, let me finish this or the gravy'll go wrong. He retreated to the hall. He stood there for a moment, alone, with the smell of the cooking drifting around him. He thought, she is nothing like I expected. He thought, I'm not sure yet what that means. Well, Chapter 5. The incident with the fence line brought things to a head in a way that had been building since the beginning. It was Elias's land, technically, and he had a dispute with a neighboring outfit, a recently arrived operation run by a man named Caldwell, who had been expanding his territory with the particular aggression of someone who'd arrived late and was making up for it. There'd been a fence line issue along the north boundary, Caldwell's men moving markers in the night, and Elias had confronted Caldwell directly, and it had not been a pleasant confrontation. He came back from it in a dark mood. Hannah saw it immediately. He came in for supper with his jaw set and his eyes nowhere in particular, and he sat at the table and the men sensed it too, and supper was quieter than usual, and after the meal the hands drifted out quickly, which they had developed an instinct for. Elias sat at the cleared table with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. Hannah came and set a plate in front of him. She'd saved him extra because he'd barely eaten. Caldwell? She said. He looked up. You mentioned him the other night, she said. The fence dispute. You remember that? I remember most things. She sat down across from him. She didn't do this usually, sit with him after the meal, but she sat now, with her own coffee, and looked at him with the calm attentiveness she brought to most problems. What happened? He told her more than he meant to. He hadn't meant to tell her anything. It was ranch business, and he still wasn't entirely sure what she was entitled to know and what was his to keep. But she asked the right questions, the kind that were really just careful listening, and the shape of the problem came out. Caldwell's aggression. The land that had been Hawthorne land for 30 years. The legal situation, which was unclear enough to be concerning. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. What does the deed say? She asked. The deed is clear. Doesn't matter if the deed is clear if a man moves the markers at night and claims he doesn't know how they got there. What do the neighboring ranchers say? The ones who've been here longer? Do they know where the original line was? He looked at her. Some of them might. Walt Greer's been here since before Caldwell, and the Manson family, East Side. She said it simply, like it was obvious. If you have 3 ranchers who can testify where the original line was, that's worth more than one man's markers. He sat with this. I know it's not my business, she said. It might be your business, he said, and meant it in more ways than he'd intended. She looked at him for a moment across the table, coffee cup in both hands. Walt Greer's wife, she said. Eleanor. She came by yesterday while you were out. She seems straightforward. I thought I might invite her for coffee. You're already working on it. I'm being neighborly. But there was something small and genuine at the edge of her mouth, almost a smile, not quite. Those can overlap sometimes. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight was doing something to the room, softening it, making it look the way he'd forgotten rooms could look. Hannah, he said. She waited. Why did you come? He didn't know exactly what he was asking. Why did you leave what you knew? Why did you agree to a stranger? Why, here, this place, this life, me? She seemed to understand the question even in its unformed state. Because I was tired, she said, and it was the most honest answer he'd heard from anyone in a long time. Tired of looking after everyone and having nowhere that was mine, tired of being useful in other people's houses. A pause. This seemed like it might be mine, or could become mine. Is it? He asked, starting to feel that way. She considered this with her characteristic seriousness, as if he'd asked something that deserved a real answer. Starting to, she said. The moon was up by the time she washed the last cup. She could hear him still moving somewhere in the house. He never went to bed before 10, she'd learned, sometimes later, the way of a man who'd spent years with no one to be considerate of and had simply kept his own hours. She stood at the kitchen window, the one with her flour sack curtains, and looked out at the dark land. The prairie at night was a different thing than the prairie in the day. In the day it was enormous and indifferent. At night it was also enormous, but there was something else in it. A presence, almost. The weight of all that open space under all those stars. She had grown up in a city. She had lived her whole life in rooms that touched other rooms, on streets that touched other streets. The frontier should have been wrong for her, in theory. Empty and brutal and indifferent to human trouble. But standing at the window, she found herself thinking that there was something almost honest about it. It didn't pretend to be anything. It was what it was, and you either found a way to live in it or you didn't. She thought, I think I can live in this. She turned off the kitchen lamp and went upstairs. In her room, she was still careful about that word, careful with the weight of it. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the small wooden box she kept on the bedside table. Inside was a photograph of her mother, taken before the illness. A letter from her youngest sister, Ruth, written 2 months ago and read so many times the fold lines were soft. A pressed flower, something Ruth had put in the envelope as an afterthought, already brittle. She sat with these things for a while. Then she put them away and lay down and looked at the ceiling and listened to the wind in the grass outside, which never entirely stopped, and thought about what starting to feel like home was actually like. It was like this, she thought, like a lamp being left on, like food on the table, like a man who asked you questions and actually waited for the answers. It wasn't finished. It wasn't easy. There were still men in the bunkhouse who didn't respect her, and a town that had already made its judgments, and a fence dispute, and 100 things that needed fixing, and a relationship that was at best a careful, cautious thing barely out of its first days. But underneath all of it, something small and stubborn. Starting to. The wind moved in the grass. She closed her eyes. Eleanor Greer arrived on a Wednesday morning with a jar of preserved peaches, and the kind of cautious friendliness that told Hannah she'd been curious for weeks and was finally allowing herself to act on it. She was a sturdy woman in her mid-40s with sun-darkened skin and the practical hands of someone who'd been working land for a long time. She looked around the kitchen with the frank assessment of a woman who knew what a neglected house looked like and was updating her expectations in real time. Walt said you'd invited me for coffee, she said, settling onto the chair Hannah offered. He seemed surprised you'd reached out. I was interested to meet the neighbors. Hannah set the coffee on and took the peaches with genuine thanks. Winter preserves were not a small gift. And I thought you might know the Manson family. I haven't met them yet. Eleanor smiled at that, a real one. Direct. I appreciate that. She put her hands around the coffee cup when Hannah set it in front of her. Yes, I know the Mansons. Dorothea Manson is about as close to a friend as I have out here, which isn't saying much for either of us, but there it is. They talked for 2 hours. Hannah learned more about the practical geography of frontier relationships in those 2 hours than she had in the previous 3 weeks. Who was trustworthy, who wasn't, which disputes were genuine and which were performance. And most usefully, the history of the north boundary line between Hawthorne Land and what was now Caldwell's operation. Walt surveyed that boundary himself 15 years ago, Eleanor said flatly. As a favor to Elias's father, he knows exactly where the line is. He'd say so in front of anyone who needed to hear it. Would he? He respects Elias. A pause. He was worried about him these last few years. The isolation. She glanced at Hannah with the careful tact of someone deciding how much to say. Walt was glad to hear he'd made an arrangement. Hannah drank her coffee. And were you? Glad? Eleanor looked at her over the rim of her cup for a moment. I didn't know what to think until I got here, she said. Now I am. It wasn't elaborate, but it landed. After Eleanor left, Hannah stood on the porch for a moment, watching the wagon diminish down the road. The air was cold and sharp and smelled of dry grass and the far-off possibility of snow. She felt something settle in her chest. Not victory, nothing so aggressive as that. Just the quiet satisfaction of a thing handled well. She went back inside and took stock of what needed doing before supper. There was always something that needed doing before supper. She had stopped minding this. When Elias came in that evening and she told him about Eleanor's information regarding Walt and the boundary survey, she watched his face do something complicated. The calculation of a man trying to figure out how a problem he'd been carrying alone had just become less heavy without him doing anything to make it so.
"You didn't have to do that," he said. "I had coffee with a neighbor," she said. "It's not a complicated thing." He was quiet for a moment. "It helps." "I know it does."
He looked at her the way he'd been doing increasingly, that careful calibrating look, like he was continuously revising something in his head and hadn't yet arrived at the final version. She had stopped finding it uncomfortable. It was, she thought, the look of a man who was actually paying attention, which was rarer than it should have been. "I'll ride over to Walt's on Friday," he said. "I told Eleanor you might." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Of course you did." She picked up the dish towel and went back to the counter. The fence dispute, as it turned out, resolved itself within 2 weeks. Walt Greer's testimony, backed by the Manson family's corroboration, made Caldwell's position untenable, and Caldwell was the kind of man who was aggressive when he thought he could win and strategic when he realized he couldn't. The markers were returned. No one made a ceremony of it, which was the right way to handle it, quietly, with the understanding that the next attempt would be answered more formally. Elias told her about it on a cold evening on the porch, both of them standing with cups of coffee because neither of them had quite gotten to the point of sitting together on the porch easily, though they were getting there. "Settled," he said. "Good," she said. That was the whole conversation, and it was sufficient. The cold deepened through November, and she learned what winter was on the frontier, which was a different education than anything she'd encountered before. Not just the cold itself, she'd known cold in Ohio, but the specific nature of frontier cold, which was the cold of wide-open spaces with nothing to break the wind, the cold of a land that had no particular opinion about whether you survived it or not. She adjusted. She found the heavier blankets in the cedar chest at the top of the stairs that she'd suspected were there since her first week. She identified the drafts in the house. There were 4 significant ones, and addressed them with what materials she had, which were not elaborate but were sufficient if applied with care. She changed the position of the stove in the sitting room by 6 inches, and it made a meaningful difference to how the heat moved through the ground floor, which she'd calculated from the way the curtains moved on cold mornings. Herschel Vane, when he saw this, looked at the repositioned stove for a long moment and then said, "Smart," in the same tone he might have used to comment on weather. "It was bothering me," she said. "Bothered all of us for 3 years," he said. "Nobody moved it." She didn't have an answer for that. She just folded the blanket she'd been carrying and went upstairs. December came in hard. The first real snow hit on a Thursday night, and by Friday morning the ranch had the closed, internal quality of a place that had turned inward against the cold, all its activity condensed into the house and the barn and the short distance between them. The men came in for breakfast stamping snow off their boots and grateful for the heat of the kitchen in a way that required no comment, because it was just plainly true. She had started making bread regularly. Not a dramatic thing. Bread was bread, but the smell of it baking in the mornings had become, she noticed, something the men oriented toward. Pete Dunbar had taken to appearing in the kitchen doorway under various pretexts at roughly the time the bread came out of the oven. She was not unaware of this. Pete was 22 and not malicious, she'd decided. Just young in the specific way of someone who'd formed most of his opinions from the people around him and hadn't yet started questioning them seriously. He'd been the one to elbow Jimmy flat on her first day, and she hadn't forgotten it, but she also hadn't been carrying it as heavily as he probably assumed she was. The day he actually spoke to her directly, not about bread or kitchen business, but actually to her, was a gray December morning with snow coming down sideways outside the window. He'd come in for a second cup of coffee, which she poured without comment, and he'd stood near the stove warming his hands and then said, with the careful casualness of someone who had rehearsed this, "I was out of line. First day you got here, I know it." She kept her hands on what she was doing. "Yes," she said. He waited for more and didn't get it. "That's it?" he said finally. "What else would you like me to say?" He seemed genuinely uncertain. "I don't know, I figured you'd be angrier." She looked at him then. He was red-faced from the cold and young and uncomfortable, and she thought about all the things she could say. about what it costs a woman to absorb that kind of careless dismissal and keep moving, about how much she'd absorbed in her life before ever arriving here, about the fact that anger was a luxury she'd never been able to afford and had mostly stopped feeling the shape of. She thought about saying all of this.
"I'll remember it," she said simply. "That's what I'll do with it." He nodded. He didn't know quite what that meant, but he seemed to understand it was the best he was getting and that it wasn't nothing. He took his coffee and went.
Elias had heard this from the hallway. She knew because she'd heard him stop walking. And he didn't come in, just continued past to wherever he'd been going. She didn't know what he'd made of it and didn't ask. She went back to the bread dough she'd been working and let the conversation be what it was. It snowed 3 days in a row the week before Christmas. The ranch became its own small world, the boundaries of it drawn in white, and the men were in closer proximity to each other and to her than they usually were. And she found that this proximity was, mostly, not uncomfortable. There had been a shift, not a dramatic one, not the kind that would make a good speech, just the ordinary shift of people who had decided to take each other seriously. She noticed it in small things. Miguel Garza, who had barely spoken a word to her in the first weeks, had started telling her things about the horses in the offhand way of someone sharing information they assumed you wanted. The bay mare's got a sore on her left foreleg, nothing serious, but she'll need checking. Tomas brought firewood without being asked, regularly, stacking it near the kitchen door where she could reach it easily. Herschel still came and sat on his stool in the evenings, but the conversations had expanded slowly, and she knew more about the history of this land now than she'd known in October. Jimmy Flatt had become, quietly and without announcement, something she might eventually call an ally. He had the social ease of a handsome man, and he'd started using it in her direction, deflecting the occasional stupid remark from whoever was having a bad day, redirecting conversations that were heading somewhere unkind. He didn't make a production of it. He just did it the way you maintain something you've decided is worth maintaining. She noticed all of this and said nothing about it, which she thought was the right instinct. Making people aware of their own change sometimes made them self-conscious enough to undo it. Christmas itself was an event that no one had discussed, and she had quietly decided to simply create. She asked Elias, a week before, what the tradition had been. He thought about it with a distance in his eyes that meant he was reaching back years. "My mother made a meal," he said. "Special one. Pie. What kind?" "Apple. And something with molasses. I don't remember what it was called." She found a recipe in an old cookbook she'd turned up in the cellar. Had been his mother's, she thought, based on the careful handwriting in the margins. Molasses cake. She made it without saying anything about the book. Christmas dinner was different from any meal she'd prepared since her arrival, not because the food was more elaborate, though it was, but because of the quality of the silence while it was eaten, not the silence of men not knowing what to say. The silence of people who were, for an hour, simply content. She caught Herschel looking at the center of the table for a long moment with an expression that was not quite nostalgia and not quite sadness, but lived somewhere between them, and she understood without asking that this table had not felt like this in a long time. Elias looked at the molasses cake when she brought it out and went very still for a moment. He didn't say anything. He cut a piece and ate it, and his jaw was set in a way that meant he was keeping his face controlled. After dinner, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes were done, he found her in the sitting room reading. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Where did you find that recipe?" She looked up from her book. "The old cookbook in the cellar. I thought it might have been your mother's." He stood there. "I shouldn't have," she started. "No," he said quickly. No, it was right." He put his hand on the doorframe as if steadying himself against something she couldn't see. "She made that every year. I'd forgotten exactly what it tasted like, and then I tasted it and—" He stopped. She waited. "Thank you," he said. It came out rough. "You're welcome, Elias." He stood for another moment. Then he said goodnight and went upstairs, and she listened to his footsteps on the stairs and thought about memory and how it lives in taste and smell in a way it doesn't live anywhere else, and how being the person who brings a memory back to someone is a peculiar and tender thing. She went back to her book. The fire had burned down to good steady coals, and the house was warm, and outside the snow had stopped, and through the window the stars were out, more stars than she'd ever seen before she came here. the sky being bigger out here in a way that still caught her off guard sometimes. January arrived with a cruelty she wasn't entirely prepared for. The cold in January was not the cold of December. It was a different thing, meaner and more patient. Water in the creek froze solid for the first time in 3 years, according to Herschel. The cattle had to be checked twice a day, and 2 of the horses needed extra care, and there was a stretch of 4 days where the temperature didn't get above something Cobb referred to as genuinely unreasonable. She had developed a cough. Not a bad one, just the persistent low-grade cough of someone who'd spent too much time in cold air without quite enough rest. She didn't mention it and was not as successful at hiding it as she thought she was. It was Elias who noticed, which surprised her. Not the cough. That was obvious. What surprised her was that he noticed what was behind it. He came in from the cold one afternoon to find her at the stove, cooking one-handed with her other arm crossed over her chest in the way people do when they've been trying to keep warm all day, and their body has given up subtlety about it. He said nothing then. But that evening, after supper, he came into the kitchen and handed her a folded piece of cloth. She shook it out. It was a heavy wool shawl, dark red, worn, but good quality. "Was my mother's," he said, the same way someone might say it's on the shelf. That particular flatness that means something is actually not flat at all. "Gets cold in here when the wind's from the north." She held the shawl for a moment. "Elias," she said. "It's a shawl," he said, and left the kitchen. She put it around her shoulders. It was warm in the specific way of something that had been well made and had lasted, and she stood for a minute in the kitchen with her eyes briefly closed, not thinking about anything particular, just standing in the warmth of it. She wore it every evening after that, and the cough was better within a week, and neither of them made any further comment about any of this, which was, she was coming to understand, entirely in keeping with how they had both learned to communicate, in the margins, between sentences, in the things that were handed across rather than said. February brought a thaw that felt like a promise, even if everyone knew it wasn't permanent. The snow pulled back from the south pastures, and the cattle moved more freely, and the men were in better spirits, and Hannah started thinking about the garden. The serious planning of it, not just the turned earth she'd left from the fall, but the actual spring garden, what it could be, what this soil needed, what grew well out here in the high dry country. She asked Herschel about it. She asked Eleanor Greer, who had become a genuine visitor now, showing up every 2 or 3 weeks. She wrote a letter to her sister Ruth asking if there were any seeds she could send, certain things she'd grown in Ohio that she wanted to try here. Ruth wrote back within 2 weeks, which was fast, which meant she'd answered the same day she'd received it. Inside the letter were seeds, 3 varieties, and a long postscript that was ostensibly about seed varieties but was actually about whether Hannah was all right, whether the frontier was what she'd expected, whether the man was decent. Hannah wrote back, "The frontier is harder than I expected, and stranger and bigger. The man is decent. I am, I think, all right. More than all right, some days." She sealed the letter and gave it to Cobb to post on his next trip to town. The afternoon she planted the first of Ruth's seeds along the south wall in the dark broken earth she'd prepared in October. She was on her knees in the cold mud working them in one by one when she became aware of a shadow and looked up. Elias was standing a few feet back, watching her. He had his hat in his hands, which he did when he wasn't sure what to do with himself. "Little early for planting," he said. "These ones are cold hardy." She pushed a seed into the soil and firmed the earth over it with her thumb. "They need to feel the last of the frost to set properly. My mother's method. She swore by it." He crouched down next to her, not to help, just to see what she was doing, and she thought again of the calibrating look he gave her, always revising, never quite arriving at the final draft. She handed him a seed from the paper envelope, and he looked at it in his palm. "What does it grow into?" "Larkspur," she said. "It won't do anything useful, won't feed anyone." She took the seed back and planted it. "But it'll be blue in June, if it takes." He was quiet for a moment, crouched in the mud beside her with his hat in his hands. "My mother had larkspur," he said. She planted another seed. "I know," she said. "I found the pressed one in the back of the cookbook." He stayed beside her until she'd planted the whole row, neither of them saying anything else, and the afternoon light came down at a low angle across the south wall, and the earth was cold and dark and full of things not yet visible, working their way toward June. The larkspur came up in April. Not all of it. Nothing ever came up all of it. That wasn't how seeds worked. But enough. Thin green shoots along the south wall, fragile looking and absolutely determined, pushing up through soil that had been frozen solid 3 weeks earlier. Hannah found them on a Tuesday morning when she went out to check, and she stood there in the early light with her coffee going cold in her hand and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was pride. Not the showy kind, the quiet kind, which is the only kind that actually means anything. She didn't tell anyone. She just went back inside and made breakfast. But Elias saw them that afternoon when he came around the south side of the house to check the wall for winter damage, and he stood looking at those thin green shoots for a long moment before continuing on his way. And that evening at supper he was quieter than usual in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet. She noticed but didn't ask. He would say something when he was ready, or he wouldn't, and either way the larkspur was coming up regardless. Spring on the frontier arrived like someone who wasn't sure they were welcome. Hesitantly, pulling back twice for every step forward. A warm week followed by a hard frost followed by 3 days of wind that stripped the warmth away before it could settle into the ground. Hannah learned to read the sky in a way she hadn't needed to before. In Ohio there had been weather. Here there was weather, something more personal, something that required attention. The men were busier now. Spring meant calving season, which meant long days and sometimes nights out in the pastures, and the ranch ran on a kind of grim, concentrated energy that Hannah had to calibrate herself to. More food, earlier starts, meals that had to hold a man through a 12-hour day in cold wind. She adjusted without discussion because discussion wasn't necessary. She just looked at what was needed and did it. It was during calving that she saw a different side of the men she'd been living alongside all winter. The tiredness in them was real and deep, and she watched them push through it the way you watch people do something that costs them genuinely, and it gave her a different measure of them than the one she'd formed in the kitchen. Pete Dunbar, who was still young enough to be annoying about most things, was tireless in the pastures. She heard this from Cobb without asking, Cobb being the kind of man who noticed fairness and reported it when it occurred. Tomas Garza hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night for a week during the worst of it and showed up for breakfast every morning and ate everything on his plate without complaint. She started leaving a lamp on later than she needed to. If someone came in from a late night in the cold, there was food kept warm on the back of the stove, and the lamp meant they didn't have to fumble in the dark. Nobody commented on this, and she didn't expect them to, but she noticed that the food was always gone by morning. The calving losses were lower than the previous year, which Elias mentioned once, briefly, to Cobb within Hannah's earshot, and she didn't know enough about cattle to know whether that was significantly good news or mildly good news. But from the way Cobb's shoulders dropped slightly, she understood it was the kind of news that had been carried tensely until it could be set down. April turned into May, and the larkspur grew and the garden became a real thing. Not the thing she'd imagined in the planning, because gardens never are exactly what you imagined, but a real growing productive thing that was already putting out early greens and would, she was confident, carry them well through summer. Elias had not commented on the garden directly since the planting, but she'd found a new trowel on the porch one morning with no explanation attached, and the soil along the east side had been turned by someone. She suspected Tomas, who had the right kind of quiet care about him, without her asking. These were the mechanics of a life building itself, slow and unannounced. She was not romantic about it. She'd been around enough lives in various states of construction to know that the building was mostly unglamorous, and the results were never quite what you'd planned. But she was learning to find that acceptable, even good. There was something honest about it. It was May when she heard them talking. She had not gone looking for information. She had been coming around the east side of the barn to find Cobb about something. She couldn't remember now what it was, something practical, and the voices stopped her before she reached the corner. Not because they were speaking about her immediately, but because the tone of it was the tone of men in a private conversation, and she had enough instinct to recognize that walking into it would be bad timing for everyone. She should have retreated. She knew that. She turned to go and then heard her name and stopped. It was Pete's voice first. "Wasn't what any of us expected. You have to say that." "What did you expect?" That was Jimmy. "I don't know, not her." A pause, and she could imagine Pete doing the thing he did when he was uncomfortable, pushing at the dirt with the toe of his boot. She's not exactly. Finish that sentence carefully. Jimmy said, and his voice had something in it that made her stay still. Pete didn't finish it. A long silence. Then, I'm saying I was wrong about her. She heard Jimmy exhale. Yeah. You were too. I know I was. Another silence. Longer. She should leave. She was still standing there. Thing is, Pete said, and his voice had shifted into something younger and more genuine, the voice he used when he wasn't performing for anyone. I was looking at her and seeing, I don't know, what I thought she should look like, what I figured would be worth something. He paused. And the whole time she was just doing things, fixing things, making things work, while I was standing there judging her for not looking the part. Jimmy didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was flat in the way of honest statements that don't require decoration. We nearly ran her off, first week, the way we acted. She didn't run. No, Jimmy said. She didn't. More silence. She heard Cobb's voice then, from further away. He'd been there the whole time, she realized, or had come up quietly. Cobb said, You two about finished explaining yourselves to each other? And there was no cruelty in it, just the dryness of a man who had already processed this particular realization and was past the point of narrating it. Yeah, Pete said quietly. I think so. She walked away from the barn and went back to the house the long way, around the north side where no one would see her, and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands on the counter, looking at nothing. She had expected, she didn't know what she'd expected. Anger, maybe. The satisfaction of vindication, which was supposed to feel like something. But what she actually felt was more complicated than that. It was the feeling of a weight she hadn't known she was still carrying being set down somewhere, gently, by other hands. She hadn't asked for it and hadn't expected it. It had just happened. She put the kettle on and stared at the south window where the flour sack curtains moved slightly in the spring breeze. And she thought about Pete saying I was looking at her and seeing what I thought she should look like. And she thought, yes, that's exactly right. That is exactly what happened. And now it wasn't happening anymore. She made her tea and went back to work. She never told Elias what she'd heard, but something of it must have communicated itself somehow through the ordinary channels of two people living in proximity, because that evening he came in for supper and looked at her with the particular attentiveness he'd been developing, sharper than before, less guarded, and said, You all right? Fine, she said. You look like you've been thinking about something. I usually am. He sat down at the table. About what? She brought the food and sat across from him, which she did most evenings now, the habit of it having established itself without discussion somewhere around February. She considered the question honestly. About how long it takes people to see something that was there from the beginning, she said. He looked at her steadily. How long does it take? Depends on the person. She picked up her fork. Some people never get there. He was quiet for a moment. You heard something today. She looked up. He wasn't asking exactly. Does it matter? She said. I suppose not. He was watching her carefully. Did it? He stopped. Started differently. Are you all right? He said again, and this time it wasn't really a question about her general state of being. It was asking something more specific, whether the hearing of it, whatever it was, had hurt her. She thought about this for a moment. I think so, she said. Yes. He nodded and picked up his fork and they ate, and outside the spring evening was doing what spring evenings did out here, turning the land gold and then rust and then finally dark blue, in stages, the sky taking its time about it. What she hadn't said, and what would take her longer to fully understand herself, was that the hearing of it had mattered to her more than she'd admitted. Not the content. She'd always known, at some level, that the men had been wrong about her in the way that people are wrong when they decide too quickly. That wasn't a surprise. What had mattered was the fact of them saying it to each other without her present, without audience, without any expectation of reward. That was the thing that sat differently in her chest. People say things to earn something often enough that when they say them for no reason except that the things are true, you notice? It was 3 days later when Elias did not come down for breakfast. This had not happened before. He was always first up or concurrent with her, always at the table before the men arrived. She waited 20 minutes and then went upstairs and knocked on his bedroom door, which she had never done before, the boundary of his room being one of the few she'd been careful about. No answer for a moment. Then, I'm up. His voice was wrong. She opened the door. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, dressed except for his boots, and his face had the gray quality of someone whose body is doing something it shouldn't be doing. He was holding his right hand with his left, and she could see, even from the doorway, that the right hand was swollen along the knuckles. "What happened?" she said. "Fence post. Yesterday, out at the North Line." He said it with the matter-of-factness of a man who was still deciding how badly he was hurt. "Slipped when I was driving it. Came down wrong." She crossed the room and he didn't object when she took his hand and looked at it. The swelling ran from the third knuckle across the back of the hand toward the wrist. She pressed carefully along the line of each bone, watching his face. He winced twice but controlled it. "Nothing's broken," she said. "Two of these knuckles might be slightly, hairline maybe. The rest is soft tissue." She'd learned this from caring for her brother, who had broken bones with some regularity throughout his childhood. "You need it wrapped, and you need to stay off it for at least a week." "I can't stay off it for a week." "You can't afford to use it wrong and have it stiffen permanently either." He looked at her. Then he looked at the hand. "Cobb can manage the North Line," she said. "Tell me what needs watching, and I'll make sure it gets relayed." He was quiet for a moment with the stubbornness of a man deciding whether to be stubborn about something. She waited. She had learned to give him his time. He wasn't slow, just deliberate, and there was a difference. "There's a section near the creek bend that needs reinforcing," he said finally. "Cobb'll know the spot." She nodded and went to get the linen strips and the small crock of the drawing salve she'd made in January from a recipe that had been her mother's. When she came back, he was still sitting on the edge of the bed, and she sat beside him, actually beside him, on the bed, which was new, and wrapped his hand with the care and competence of someone who had done things like this before, who had been the one that people brought their injuries to because she was the one who knew what to do. He watched her hands work. "You've done this before," he said. "My brother," she said. He was 15 before he figured out that his body was not in fact indestructible. He made a small sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him. She tied off the wrapping and looked up and found him closer than she'd expected. They were sitting together on the narrow bed edge, and the distance between them was not large. And his eyes, when she looked directly into them, were tired and also something else, something she didn't try to name yet. "Thank you," he said. "It's a hand," she said, and stood up. He stood too, and reached for his boots with the wrong hand and stopped, and she had already crouched and picked one up before either of them thought about it. And she helped him with his boots with the straightforward efficiency of someone for whom practicality had always been more available than embarrassment. When he went downstairs, she stood in his bedroom for a moment. It was spare, this room. A bed, a chest, a small table with a lamp and a pocket watch. A coat on the back of the door. On the wall above the chest, a small framed photograph. Two people she recognized as Thomas Hawthorne and his wife, though she'd never seen photographs of them before. In their younger years. Serious face the way people were in old photographs, standing in front of a house that was recognizably this house without the years on it. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she went downstairs. Elias worked with one hand for the better part of 2 weeks, which meant Cobb carried more, and the other men absorbed the rest without complaint, which itself was a kind of barometer. 3 months ago, she thought, there might have been grumbling. Now there was just the adjustment, the collective lean into the gap, the ordinary response of people who considered themselves a unit. She was not certain when that had happened. She suspected it had been the winter, the long close quarters of it, the cold that had pressed them all into the house and forced a kind of familiarity that the open months had allowed them to avoid. Or maybe it had been the Christmas meal, or maybe it was simply the accumulated weight of daily things, the bread and the kept lamp and the stove repositioned 6 inches to the left, the small, uncelebrated acts that say, "I am paying attention to you," and that people register even when they don't know they're registering. The hand healed, not as fast as Elias wanted. He was an impatient patient, not difficult, just clearly unused to limitation, but steadily and without complication, which she was grateful for. She changed the wrapping every other day and checked the knuckles each time, and he submitted to this with the resignation of a man who recognized that the choice had already been made for him. Once, midway through the second week, while she was rewrapping, he said, "You don't have to keep doing this yourself. I can manage." She looked up. "Can you?" He looked at the hand. "No," he admitted. "Then stop arguing." He did.
It was at the end of May, the hand mostly healed, the larkspur now showing its first color. Just color, not yet fully open, but there. That Jimmy Flat came to her with something she hadn't expected.
He came to the kitchen door in the late afternoon, hat in hand, and he looked like a man who had been working up to something for a while. She knew the look. She'd seen it on Pete when he'd apologized and on Elias various times, and on most people when they were trying to say something honest and weren't sure how it would land. "Ma'am," he said. She was chopping and kept chopping. "Jimmy!" He came inside and stood near the door. He was quiet for a moment in a way that meant the speech he'd prepared was giving him trouble. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A proper one. Not just, I've been decent lately, I know that, but that's not the same as actually saying it." She put the knife down and turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at him. He met her eyes, which she gave him credit for. "First day you got here," he said. "Pete and me, that was—" He shook his head. "That was ugly. You hadn't done a single thing and we were already writing you off. I've been thinking about it since Christmas, actually. What kind of man does something like that? Makes his mind up about a person before she's even—" He stopped. "Anyway, I'm sorry, I mean it." She looked at him for a long moment. Jimmy Flat was not a man who found humility easy. It ran against the grain of him, the easy confidence, the good looks that had always let him move through the world with a certain frictionlessness. This was costing him something. "I know you mean it," she said. "I've seen it." He nodded. "Jimmy," she said, "what you've done since, that counts. The apology counts too. But what actually changed things was the daily of it." She picked up the knife again. "Words are easy. You know that." "Yes, ma'am." "So does that make sense?" "Yes, ma'am." He put his hat back on and then took it off again. "For what it's worth, this place is different than it was. Better. And that's because of you." She started chopping again. "It's because of everyone," she said, "including you." He left. She heard his boots on the porch and then in the dirt. She kept chopping, and the afternoon light came through the flour sack curtains and moved across the floor in a long rectangle, and outside the larkspur was almost blue. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing because she had not been there, was that Elias had witnessed this from the hallway. He had come in from the barn quietly, the way he did, and had stopped before the kitchen when he heard voices, and he had stood in the hall with his back against the wall and listened to the entire exchange. And what happened in him during those 3 or 4 minutes in the hallway was not a simple thing. He had known, in the abstract way of a man who is aware that he's been unfair without having confronted it directly, that he had failed Hannah in the early weeks. He had told himself he'd addressed it. The quiet word with the men, the apology he'd offered her in the kitchen that she'd accepted without drama. He had allowed himself to believe that having said the thing was the same as having felt it fully. Standing in the hall listening to Jimmy Flat do something genuinely difficult and watching her respond with something genuinely gracious, he understood that he had not felt it fully at all. He had processed it at the surface level. Yes, the men were unkind. Yes, I should have done more. Without going to the place underneath where the real accounting was. The real accounting was this. He had doubted her himself. Not loudly, not consciously, but the doubt had been there. The reflex assessment that had happened on the platform when he'd seen her step off the train and felt his expectations recalibrate. He had never, in any honest internal moment, confronted that. He had let the subsequent weeks and the evidence of her competence do the work without him ever actually examining the thing that had been in him that first day. He walked through the kitchen when Jimmy was gone. Hannah glanced at him. "Good timing," she said, "or bad timing, depending." "I heard." She nodded and kept chopping. He got himself a cup of water and stood at the window, looking out at the south wall where the larkspur was almost open. The color was there. He could see it even from here. That particular blue, the kind of blue that was almost violet, that his mother had always called the color of almost dark. He turned around. "I owe you the same thing he just gave you," he said, "only it's worse in my case because I should have known better." She put the knife down again and turned around and looked at him. She had the steady look she brought to things she was taking seriously. "Elias." "No," he said. "Let me." He set the cup down. "When you stepped off that train, I looked at you and I—" He stopped. Started again with the bluntness of a man who had decided the only way through was direct. My first thought was wrong, and I didn't say anything about it to myself then. I just let it live there and told myself I'd been decent, and that was enough. She was very still. It wasn't enough, he said, and I knew it and didn't look at it, which is a kind of cowardice that I don't have much patience for it in other people, and I had it in myself. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved in the grass. "What was your first thought?" she asked. Her voice was even, careful, asking a question she actually wanted answered. He held her eyes. "That I could have done better," he said. "By appearance. That you weren't—" He stopped, because even saying it in past tense was bad enough. "I thought it and didn't challenge it and kept right on being civil to you while that thing sat there." She was quiet for a long moment. He waited. "I know," she said finally. "I know you know. I saw it on your face on the platform." She wasn't saying it cruelly, just factually. "I saw it and I thought, well, I'll just have to show him." A pause. "I've had to do that my whole life, show people the thing they couldn't see from the outside." "That's not—" He shook his head. "That shouldn't have been required of you here. Not from the beginning." "No," she agreed. "It shouldn't have been." She picked up the knife. "But it was, and I did. And here we are." He stayed at the window. She went back to chopping. The afternoon settled around them. The ordinary sounds of the kitchen, the light moving slowly across the floor. After a while she said without looking up, "Elias, you told me. That's what matters." He was quiet. "Most men don't," she said. "Most men just live with the thing and let it make them smaller. You told me. He looked at her, the dark hair coming loose at the back, the capable hands, the straightness of her spine, and thought about what it had taken her to come here, to stand on that platform in front of a crowd of strangers, to walk into a house full of doubtful men and simply begin, without complaint, without waiting for permission. The Larkspur opened fully the next morning. She found it at dawn, fully blue, and she stood there with her coffee and looked at it until the coffee was cold, and she didn't know that he was watching from the upstairs window, hadn't heard him get up, didn't know that he stood there for a while looking not at the flowers, but at her standing there looking at them, and that the expression on his face in that early light was one he hadn't worn in a long time and couldn't quite name yet. He went downstairs and put fresh coffee on. It was the least he could do. The fresh coffee was on the stove when she came back inside, and she noticed it immediately. The pot moved to the front burner, still hot, which meant someone had been down recently and had thought to do it. She knew it was him. The men didn't touch the coffee setup in the mornings. That had been established in the first week without anyone saying so directly. She poured a cup and stood at the window where the Larkspur was fully visible from the kitchen, all that blue along the south wall, and thought about the conversation the night before. The way he'd stood at the window and said, "I thought it," and didn't challenge it. She had not expected that. Not because she thought him dishonest, but because she had learned over 31 years that the particular admission he'd made, the one that required a person to look at their own reflex, the thing they'd felt before thinking, and call it what it was the kind most people spent their whole lives finding ways around. She drank her coffee and started breakfast and did not let herself make too much of it. That was a habit she'd developed early and kept carefully, not making too much of things while they were still new, not building on ground that hadn't settled yet. June came in warm and generous in the way that made you forget, temporarily, what February had been. The garden was producing now, real production, not just the hopeful green of early spring, but actual food coming out of the ground, lettuces, early radishes, the snap peas that had climbed the twine she'd strung along the south wall beside the Larkspur. Hannah preserved what could be preserved and used the rest fresh, and the kitchen in those weeks smelled like summer in a way she hadn't been able to create all winter. Elias noticed things he hadn't noticed before, or noticed them differently. He caught himself more than once, in the middle of some ordinary ranch task, mending tack in the barn, riding the fence line, thinking about what she'd be doing at that hour. Not with worry, or not only with worry, just aware. The ranch felt different now in a way that he couldn't have produced an argument for if someone had asked, a quality that wasn't in any particular thing but in the aggregate of things, like the difference between a room with air moving through it and a room without. He told himself this was simply the difference that a managed household made, which was true as far as it went. But he was becoming aware that it didn't go all the way. The thing he hadn't said in the kitchen the night he'd apologized, the thing under the apology, deeper than the admission about the platform, was that somewhere in the long winter, without being able to identify the day or even the week, his doubts about the arrangement had shifted into something else entirely. Not the absence of doubt, exactly, but something that had moved past it, the way you move past a low spot in a road, feeling the wheels drop and then rise, and then the surface is smooth again, and you barely remember where the rough part was. He hadn't said this. He wasn't sure yet how to. It was Herschel who typically addressed the situation without asking anyone's permission. It was a Wednesday afternoon in early June, and Elias was in the barn working on a saddle that needed new rigging. And Herschel came in and sat on the hay bale he'd been sitting on since before Elias could remember, and was quiet for a while in the way that meant he had something to say and was choosing his moment. Elias kept working. "That woman," Herschel said finally. Elias didn't look up. "What about her?" "You paying attention?" "To what?" Herschel was quiet for a long moment. "To what you have," he said, "is what I'm asking." Elias set the rigging down and looked at the old man. Herschel had a face like country that had been through every season multiple times, lined and patient and not requiring much in return. He was looking at Elias with the particular expression he reserved for things he considered obvious. "I'm aware of what I have," Elias said. "Being aware and paying attention aren't the same thing." Herschel picked up a piece of straw and turned it in his fingers. "I've been on this land since your father broke the first ground. I've watched men do stupid things with good things they didn't know to value until they'd lost them." He looked at the straw. "I'm not saying you're one of those men. I'm asking if you're paying attention." Elias looked at the saddle for a long moment. "She's not going anywhere," he said, though even as he said it, he recognized the defensive quality of it, the response of a man who is using a fact as a way of not answering the actual question. "No," Herschel said. "She's not, because she's not that kind. She makes her decisions, and she keeps them." He put the straw down. "But there's a difference between a woman who stays and a woman who stays and knows she's valued. You might want to think about which one you're offering her." He got up from the hay bale with the deliberate care of old joints and walked out without looking back. Elias sat with the saddle and the rigging and the silence of the barn for a long time after. What Herschel had said landed in him the way true things land when you're not quite ready for them. Not as a revelation, because he already knew it, but as the particular discomfort of having something you already know stated plainly by someone who doesn't dress things up. The knowing and the doing were separate things. He'd been parking himself in the knowing and not moving toward the doing. The reason was not complicated. He was 55% certain that he was afraid, which was a proportion he found embarrassing given that fear had never been something he'd had much patience for in himself. He had faced down debt and drought and weather that had killed men who'd been on the land longer than him, and he had not been afraid in any way he'd recognize as fear. But this particular thing, standing in front of her and saying the thing clearly, not as apology, not as correction of past wrong, but as the direct statement of how things actually stood with him. This was producing something in his chest that had the shape and weight of fear, even if he refused to call it that. He finished the rigging and went in for supper and was, by his own assessment, not great company at the table. Hannah noticed. She didn't ask about it, which was, he'd come to understand, her way of leaving doors open without forcing them. She noticed, and she let him have whatever he was working through, and she passed him the bread and refilled his coffee and ran supper with the same steady competence she brought to everything. And after the men left, she did the dishes with the window open to the warm evening air. He dried. He'd started doing this a few weeks ago, picking up a dish towel after supper while she washed. Neither of them had made a decision about it. It had just happened the way some things happen between people who spent enough time in the same space, gradually becoming a pattern without anyone proposing it. They worked through the dishes in the ordinary quiet. Then she drained the wash water and dried her hands and turned around and leaned against the counter, and she looked at him with the frank steadiness he'd come to know as her natural mode and said, "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She waited with the patience of someone who had decided not to collude with the deflection. He put the dish towel down. He looked at the wall, then the window, then her. He had been a man of few words for 39 years, And the words he was reaching for now were not words he had practiced with, and that showed, and he was going to say them anyway. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to understand it's not a practical question." She was still. "All right. Are you—" He stopped, started differently. "You told me in October that this place was starting to feel like yours, that it was starting to feel like home." He held her eyes. "I want to know if that's still true, and I want to know if I'm a part of that, or if I'm just the man who owns the land." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a nightbird was calling from the direction of the creek, the same one that had been at it for a week. Hannah looked at him for a long moment. He could not read her expression, which was unusual. He'd gotten reasonably good at reading her over the winter, and the unreadability of it was doing something uncomfortable to him. "That's not a small question," she said. "I know. Why now?" He thought about Herschel in the barn. "Because I've been putting it off," he said. "And I'm done putting it off." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at her hands, the worn knuckles, the capable hands that had fixed and grown and built their way through a winter and a spring, and she looked back up. "Yes," she said, "it's still true. Both things." He breathed. "But," she said, and the words sat there for a second, "I need you to say what you're actually trying to say, Elias, because I think you're still 3 steps back from it." He looked at her. She was right. He knew she was right. He was standing at the edge of the thing and finding ways to approach it obliquely, the way he'd been doing for months. The dish towel picked up after supper, the trowel left on the porch, the shawl offered with, "It's just a shawl," all of it meaning something he hadn't yet said directly. "I don't want you to stay because you made an agreement," he said. "I want you to stay because you want to be here. With me specifically. Not the land, not the arrangement." He felt the words come out imperfect and blunt and true. "I don't know when that started mattering to me as a separate thing, but it does." The nightbird called from the creek. Hannah was quiet for a long time, long enough that he felt the specific discomfort of a man who has said something real and doesn't know yet what will be done with it. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to hear it without arguing." "All right. I came here with almost nothing." She said it plainly, not as complaint. "I spent 12 years running other people's lives and carrying everyone who needed carrying, and by the time I got on that train, I was so tired I couldn't feel the edges of myself anymore. I didn't know what I wanted because I hadn't been asked in so long." She paused. "I came here because I needed somewhere to land. That's the honest truth." He nodded. "But what happened after?" she said. "That was different. The winter, the work, the—" She stopped, and for the first time he saw something in her face that was less than steady, a slight unevenness that told him whatever came next was costing her more than her usual things. "I started wanting to be here. Not needing to be. Wanting to. And there's a difference, Elias. There's a real difference." "I know there is. You specifically," she said. "The questions you ask and the way you listen and the coffee that was on the stove this morning that you didn't say anything about." She looked at him directly. "Yes. You specifically." He crossed the kitchen and he stood in front of her, close enough that this was not ambiguous anymore. And he looked at her face, the tiredness that still lived under her eyes, the steadiness that didn't, the specific way she was looking at him right now, which was not like any way she'd looked at him before. And he said, "I'm sorry it took me this long to ask." "You asked," she said. "That's what matters." He put his hand on the side of her face, careful, not certain it was welcome and knowing he was going to do it anyway, and she didn't step back. She put her hand over his, briefly, and then dropped it, and they stood there in the kitchen with the window open to the June night, and the nightbird calling, and the larkspur blue in the dark outside. He kissed her. Once, not long, and she let him. And when he pulled back, she was looking at him with that unreadable expression again. Only now he thought he understood what it was. It was the expression of someone who had been hoping for something without letting themselves know they were hoping, and now it had happened, and they were still catching up to it. "The dishes are done," she said. He smiled. It was not a big smile. He was not a man built for big smiles, but it was real, and she saw it, and something in her face shifted toward warmth. "They are," he said. She turned the lamp down, and they went through the house together, and he stopped at the bottom of the stairs, and she stopped too. And they stood there for a moment in the low light, Elias, she said. Yeah. I'm glad I got on the train. He looked at her in the dim hallway of the house his father had built, with the repaired wallpaper and the worn floors and all the evidence of a life being rebuilt out of something that had been going to ruin. So am I, he said. I should have said it sooner. You said it now. She went upstairs. He stood in the hallway for a moment, then went and checked the door and the stove damper and the lamp and all the ordinary things a man does at the end of a day on his own land, and the doing of them felt different than it had the night before, than it had any night he could recently remember. Not completed differently. Just inhabited. Like the house had room in it for the weight of two people's lives, and he was only now feeling how much better that distributed the load. He went to bed and lay in the dark with the window cracked to the warm night and the sound of the creek, faint at this distance, and the night birds still at it. He thought about Hannah on the train platform with her rope-latched suitcase and her worn dress and her calm, tired eyes, and the thought he'd had standing there, the wrong thought, the one he'd admitted to her, and how wrong it had been in the most complete and specific way, in the way that made a man realize that what he thought he knew about value and what value actually was were two different maps of the same country, and the one he'd been using had left out almost everything that mattered. He was 39 years old, and he had, through either stubbornness or circumstance or some combination, spent the better part of a decade making himself smaller without knowing it. The house had gone to neglect not because he didn't have money, but because there was no reason to make it anything more than functional, and that absence of reason had been the loneliness made structural, built into the peeling wallpaper and the curtainless windows. She had put the curtains up. She had replanted the garden. She had taken his mother's cookbook from the cellar and made the molasses cake from the handwritten recipe and set it on the Christmas table and broken something open in him that he hadn't known was sealed. He fell asleep before he meant to, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, he did not wake up once in the night. Downstairs, the lamp was out, the fire banked, the kitchen settled into the quiet of a room that had been used well. Outside, the larkspur stood dark in the moonlight, all that blue invisible now, but there, real, growing from ground that had been cold and hard and broken and given time had become something else. The nightbird had stopped by midnight. By morning, the ranch had the look it always had at first light, the gray sky, the dew-wet grass, the cattle shapes in the south pasture. But the man who walked to the barn at 5:15 and the woman who came downstairs at 5 and put the coffee on were not precisely the same people who had gone to bed the night before. Not changed dramatically, just shifted, the way weight redistributes, the way a balance finds its true point and settles. She heard him come in from the barn at 6, and she poured him coffee without being asked and set it where he'd sit. And he came in and saw it and sat down, and neither of them said anything about the night before because they didn't need to. It had been said. It was the kind of thing once said that doesn't need repeating. It just changes the ground you're standing on. Garden's got aphids on the snap peas, she said, at the stove. Is that bad? Manageable. She stirred. I'll need to deal with it this morning. I'll look at the east fence after. Herschel said there's a section near the dry creek bed. I know the one. The coffee was hot, and the morning light was coming through the flour sack curtains, and outside the larkspur was the particular blue it was in early light, before the sun had fully committed to the day, and the ranch was waking up the way it did, in stages, with noise and movement and the smell of the day coming on. It was not a perfect morning. The aphids were real, and the fence needed work, and there was a tension in Elias's jaw that meant something on his mind hadn't resolved yet, and Hannah burned the edge of the cornbread slightly because she was thinking about something else. And Pete Dunbar was in a foul mood for reasons he didn't explain and made the breakfast table louder than it needed to be. It was an ordinary morning on an imperfect working ranch in the second year of a marriage that had started from almost nothing and was, slowly, stubbornly, becoming something real. She scraped the burned edge off the cornbread and served the rest, and nobody said a word about it except Herschel, who looked at his piece and then at her with something in his old eyes that was almost humor, and said, "Still better than anything we had before you got here." She put the basket down. "You have low standards, Herschel." "Had low standards," he said, and ate his cornbread. The aphids on the snap peas turned out to be the least of June's problems. 3 days after the kitchen conversation, after the kiss and the nightbird and the morning that had shifted something fundamental in the ground between them, A rider came in from the east at mid-morning with word that 2 of Hawthorne's cattle had been found on Caldwell's side of the boundary line. Not wandered over, moved. The tracks told a story that wasn't accidental, and the rider, a young man named Doss who worked for Walt Greer and had been sent as a courtesy, had the look of someone delivering news they knew would ignite something. Elias heard it standing in the yard with his hat in his hand and his jaw doing the thing it did when he was controlling what showed on his face. Caldwell's claiming they were on his land when he found them, Doss said. He's saying he's within rights to hold them. Cobb, standing nearby, made a sound that was not a word but communicated a full opinion. How many men does he have over there right now? Elias asked. 4 that I saw. Maybe more in the barn. Elias was quiet for a moment. He turned the hat in his hands once, twice. Hannah had come onto the porch when she'd heard the rider, and she was standing there now with her arms crossed against the morning cool, listening without interrupting, which was one of her qualities he'd come to rely on without ever having asked for it. I'll ride over, Elias said. Elias. Her voice was even. He looked at her. Take Cobb and Miguel. Don't go alone. He looked at her for a moment. She held his eyes steadily, not asking, just stating the practical thing as if it were obvious, which it was, which was why he'd already been thinking it. I know, he said. I know you know, she said. I'm saying it anyway. He almost smiled. He put his hat on and went to the barn. The confrontation with Caldwell was not the kind that makes a good story, which is to say it was tense and ugly and resolved not through any dramatic speech or physical contest, but through the grinding, unglamorous process of 2 men who both knew the legal situation standing in a field, arguing about it until one of them calculated that the cost of continuing was higher than the cost of backing down. Caldwell was a large man with a fleshy face, and the particular arrogance of someone who'd built something and confused the building of it with being right about everything. He stood at his fence line with 2 of his men behind him and looked at Elias with naked dislike. Those cattle were on my land, he said. Those cattle have my brand, Elias said. And the fence line they crossed to get to your land was surveyed by Walt Greer 15 years ago and is on record in Millhaven, which you know. Surveys can be wrong. Walt Greer's aren't. Silence. Caldwell's jaw moved slightly, the grinding of a man recalculating. I want compensation for the feed they consumed on my land, Caldwell said. Cobb made the sound again. Elias looked at Caldwell for a long moment. I'll take my cattle, he said. That's what I'll do. And if anything of mine ends up on your side of the line again, we'll have this conversation in front of the county judge instead of in a field. He had the cattle home by noon. He came in for lunch and sat at the table and ate without talking much. The same focused silence of a man who is still burning off the adrenaline of a conflict that hadn't gone physical, but had wanted to. Hannah put food in front of him and poured coffee and sat across from him and didn't ask him to talk about it yet, just let the meal be what it was. After, when the men had gone, she said, Is it done? For now. Will it stay done? He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Caldwell's the kind of man who moves when he thinks he can and stops when he thinks he can't. He'll try something else eventually, something smaller. He looked up. But the land's not going anywhere, and neither am I. She nodded. Neither am I, she said, and it was said simply, not dramatically, just as a fact being confirmed, and that was how he heard it. Not as a declaration, but as the ordinary solid truth of a woman who had made her decision and was not revisiting it. The summer that followed was the hardest work Hawthorne Ranch had seen in years, which also meant it was the most productive. Word had gotten out, through Walt Greer, through Eleanor, through the ordinary channels of frontier information, that the ranch was running well, better than it had, that there was management in the house now, and the outfit was sound. 2 men came looking for work in July. Elias hired one of them, a quiet, steady man named Aurelio from somewhere south, who could work horses in a way that made even Cobb stop and watch occasionally. The other man he didn't hire because something was off about him in a way Elias couldn't specify and had learned over 39 years to trust. He told Hannah this at supper, and she said, I thought the same thing, and neither of them asked the other how they'd arrived at the same conclusion, because some things you just recognize. July brought heat, and the garden came into its full production, and the kitchen smelled of everything that summer makes possible. Tomatoes and herbs, and the sharp green smell of fresh beans, and the sweetness of the first corn. Hannah put up preserves with a thoroughness that made clear she was thinking about February already, the rows of jars in the cellar multiplying week by week. She had learned from one winter what the second winter would require. Ruth came to visit in August. This was something Hannah had not quite expected, though she'd been the one to write and invite her, sometime back in March, when the winter had broken, and she'd felt solid enough in her footing here to want to share it. Ruth's letter accepting had arrived in May, the actual arrival of her sister in a wagon from Millhaven Station. Small and red-haired and apparently undaunted by the 11-mile ride over bad roads, was different than the anticipation of it. Hannah stood on the porch and watched the wagon come down the drive and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, which was the specific emotion of seeing someone who had known you before you became who you currently were. Ruth had known her in the Ohio kitchen, in the years of carrying everyone, in the worn-down version of herself she'd brought to this train platform a year ago. The question of whether who she was now would be visible to someone who'd known who she'd been then was one she hadn't let herself examine too closely. Ruth stepped down from the wagon and looked at the house and the garden and the larkspur, gone to seed now but still standing, and then looked at Hannah on the porch. "You look different," Ruth said. "Do I?" "Yes." Ruth came up the porch steps and hugged her, and Hannah held her sister and felt the particular relief of a thing you didn't know you'd been needing. "You look like yourself," Ruth said into her shoulder. The version that was always supposed to be there. Hannah pulled back and looked at her sister's familiar face. "You're being dramatic." "I'm being accurate." Ruth looked past her into the house. "Is he here?" "Out at the north pasture. Back for supper." Ruth smiled the way younger sisters smile when they've been wanting to have an opinion about something and have been waiting for their moment. "I have questions." "I know you do." "I have a lot of questions." "I assumed." She showed Ruth the house and the garden and the kitchen and the larkspur beds, and Ruth asked questions about all of it with the genuine curiosity of someone who was trying to understand a life from the evidence of how it was being lived. She asked about the curtains and the cookbook and the garden plan and the men, and Hannah answered honestly, including the parts that weren't simple. The first weeks, the difficulty of it, Pete and Jimmy on the platform, the long winter of proving. "And now?" Ruth asked. "And now they respect me," Hannah said, "which isn't the same as liking me, necessarily, but it's more durable." Ruth absorbed this. They were in the kitchen, Ruth sitting at the table with coffee, Hannah doing the prep for supper. "And him?" Hannah kept her hands on what she was doing. "He's a good man," she said. "He was wrong about some things, and he told me so, directly, which is rarer than it should be." "That's not what I asked." Hannah looked at her sister over her shoulder. Ruth had the expression she'd had since childhood, the one that meant she'd already figured out the answer and was waiting for her older sister to catch up. "No," Hannah said. "It isn't." She turned back to the counter. "He matters to me, more than I expected when I got off that train." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Are you happy?" Hannah considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. Not the reflexive yes, I'm fine that she'd been giving people for 12 years. The actual consideration. "Most days," she said. "Some days it's hard and some days something goes wrong and there are still moments where I don't know if I fit here." She paused. "But I keep choosing it. Every day I keep choosing it. I think that's what happy actually looks like when you're an adult." Ruth was quiet. Then she said softly, "Mom would have liked this place." Hannah kept her hands moving. "I know," she said. "I think about that sometimes." Elias came in for supper to find 2 women in his kitchen and the table set properly for the first time in memory, which Hannah had done because Ruth's presence had made her want to make the room look like what it had become. He shook Ruth's hand with the careful formality of a man who was aware he was being assessed, which he was, and Ruth assessed him with the frank attention of a younger sister who had been worrying about her older one for years and was updating her calculations in real time. Supper was the best meal Hannah had made since Christmas. She'd done it deliberately, not as performance, but because Ruth being there made her want to show what this place was now, the full version of it, all the accumulated work made visible in a meal the way it could be. Elias, to his credit, talked more than usual. Not a lot, but enough that Ruth could get a sense of him, the directness of him, the way he listened, the dry humor that appeared occasionally like something he'd forgotten he had. At one point, he said something about the fence dispute with Caldwell, and Ruth laughed, not politely but genuinely, and Elias looked briefly surprised by it, and then something eased in his face. After supper, while Hannah washed up, Ruth sat on the porch with Elias. Hannah could hear them through the open window, not the words, just the register of the conversation. Ruth asking, Elias answering, a pause, then something that made both of them quiet in a way that sounded respectful. Later, after Elias had gone to check the stock, and it was just the two sisters on the porch, in the late evening, Ruth said, "He watches you." Hannah looked at the darkening land. "I know, like he's still figuring out what he has." "He's that kind of man, slow to arrive but solid once he's there." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I was worried about you," she said. "When you left?" "I didn't say it in the letter, but I was." "I know. I thought you'd go somewhere hard and find it harder and come back, or not come back, which would have been worse." She looked at her hands. "You didn't even sound like yourself before you left. You were so tired." "I was." "And now?" Hannah looked at the south wall where the larkspur stood dry and spent in the evening shadow, past its blue now, gone to the business of making seeds for next year. The garden behind it, the preserved jars in the cellar, the flour sack curtains she could see from here through the kitchen window. "Now I'm tired in the right way," she said. "The way that comes from work that's yours, not from holding everyone else up." Ruth reached over and took her hand briefly. Hannah let her. The night was warm and still, and the stars were coming out above the prairie in their enormous quantity, and the two sisters sat on the porch of a house that had been hollow for years and was hollow no longer. Ruth stayed 4 days and left on a Thursday morning, her wagon back to Millhaven loaded with 2 jars of preserves and a cutting of the larkspur seeds that Hannah had wrapped in paper and tied with twine. Standing at the porch railing watching her go, Hannah felt the leave-taking the way you feel things that are real, completely, without softening. Elias came and stood beside her when the wagon was small in the distance. "She's good," he said. "She is. Worried about you when you came here." Hannah looked at him. "She told you that?" "Last night on the porch." He was looking at the road. "She said she wanted me to know that you had people, that there was someone paying attention." Hannah understood what that was. The particular thing a younger sister does when she can't protect someone directly and does it obliquely instead. The love in it, unglamorous and specific. "What did you say?" she asked. "I told her I knew," he said, "and that I was paying attention too." She looked at the empty road where the wagon had been. "Herschel told you to do that?" she said. "Pay attention." He did. He was quiet for a moment. "He's right more often than I tell him." She turned and went inside, and he followed, and the door closed behind them on the bright August morning. September came, and with it the second round of the Caldwell problem, which arrived not as a confrontation this time, but as a legal notice. A formal filing with the county clerk claiming a portion of the North Pasture boundary, packaged in the language of legitimate dispute, but clearly aimed at forcing either a costly legal fight or a concession of land. Elias read the document at the kitchen table, and Hannah read it after him, and then they sat with it between them. "He's not stupid," Elias said. "No," she agreed. "He's calculated." She looked at the document. "He knows you'd rather work your land than fight over it. He's betting on that." He'd be right, under other circumstances. But not these. Not these. He looked at her. "Walt Greer's survey and the Manson testimony is still valid. We have that." "You need a lawyer." He nodded. He didn't like lawyers on principle, which was a frontier disposition she'd come to understand was almost universal and almost entirely counterproductive. "Millhaven doesn't have one worth the name." "There's one in Deering," she said. "Eleanor mentioned him. She said Walt used him for a property matter 2 years ago." He looked at her. "You asked Eleanor about lawyers?" "I asked Eleanor about the Deering lawyer, yes." She returned his look steadily. "I asked in May. After the cattle incident, I thought it was worth knowing." He sat back in his chair. There was something in his face that she'd come to recognize. The particular expression of a man who kept encountering evidence that the person he was living with had been thinking further ahead than him and was not going to make a production of it. "You could have told me," he said. "You weren't ready to think about lawyers in May. You were still angry."
He opened his mouth, closed it. "That's accurate," he said. "I know it is." The Deering lawyer's name was Pratt, and he turned out to be exactly as competent as Eleanor had indicated, which was to say formidably so. He reviewed the situation, examined the survey documentation, spoke with Walt Greer, and filed a counter-response with the county clerk that was, by all accounts, so thorough that Caldwell's own legal man had sent word within 3 weeks that his client was withdrawing the filing. It cost money. Not ruinous money, but real money. And Elias paid it without complaint, which Hannah noted as a kind of maturity, the recognition that some costs are what you pay for things worth having. The day the withdrawal came through, Elias told her at supper in front of all the men, which was unusual for him. He typically managed such things privately. He read the letter aloud at the table, briefly, just the relevant part, and then he looked at Hannah and said, "Her idea, the lawyer, in May." The table was quiet for a moment. "Good thinking, ma'am," Miguel said. Pete Dunbar, who had grown up considerably in the 9 months since her arrival, raised his coffee cup slightly in her direction without quite meeting her eyes, which was, from Pete, something close to ceremonial acknowledgement. Herschel said nothing, but when she passed him in the kitchen doorway an hour later, he said very quietly, "Well done," and kept walking, and that was, from Herschel, a speech. October arrived, and with it the anniversary of her arrival, though neither of them mentioned it as such. She thought about it privately on the morning of the 4th, exactly 1 year since the train platform, the rope-latch suitcase, the crowd of strangers with their assessments already forming. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked at the south wall garden, put to bed for winter now, just bare-turned earth and the dry skeletons of the larkspur that she'd left standing because they'd make seeds for spring. A year. She tried to measure it, what had happened in it, and found the measure didn't really work. You couldn't quantify a winter of proving yourself or a conversation in a dark hallway or a shawl passed across a kitchen with "it's just a shawl" or seeds going into cold ground, or a man saying "I thought it" and didn't challenge it with his eyes on hers and nowhere to hide. You couldn't count up a life changing and get a number that meant anything. Elias came in from the barn and poured himself coffee and stood beside her at the window, and they looked together at the bare garden, the dry larkspur, the turned earth. "It's been a year," he said. So he'd been thinking about it too. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something." "You've said that before." "Last time I meant it." "So does now." He turned from the window and looked at her directly. The deliberate full attention of him, which she'd come to understand was not common currency with him, was something he gave specifically and not casually. "I want this to be a real marriage," he said. "Not the arrangement, not the agreement we both honored, and that worked out fine. A real one." He paused. "I think it already is, mostly, but I want to say it plainly." She looked at him. The morning light was coming through the flour sack curtains and falling across the kitchen floor, and he was standing in it. This man who was not easy and not perfect and had been wrong about important things and had said so, who left trowels on porches and put coffee on at 6 in the morning without announcement, who had stood in a field with Caldwell and not backed down, who had crouched in the mud beside her planting larkspur in cold ground and stayed until the row was done. "It already is," she said. "But I'll say it plainly, too. Yes." He put his hand over hers where it held the coffee cup. His hand was rough and warm, and she turned hers under it, and they stood at the window looking at the bare garden and the dry larkspur standing in the October light, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else was needed. What happened in the months that followed was not a transformation in the story sense, not the clean, dramatic kind. It was something more ordinary and more durable. Hawthorne Ranch continued to run, and ran better, and the men who worked it continued to become, gradually and imperfectly, people who considered themselves part of something rather than hired hands at something. Pete Dunbar grew up enough to stop being the youngest thing on the property in the way that annoyed everyone. Jimmy Flatt used his social ease in directions that were useful rather than careless. Aurelio turned out to have a talent for managing cattle in bad weather that was worth considerably more than his wage. Herschel got no younger, but seemed no older either, as if he'd reached some plateau of age that he intended to occupy indefinitely. Cobb Rafferty, who had ridden out with the telegram a year ago and handed it to Elias like a man delivering a snake,
came to Hannah one afternoon in November with his hat in his hands and said, with the brevity of a man who considered concision a form of respect, "This place is better. You should know that." She took it for what it was. The town of Millhaven recalibrated slowly, the way small towns do, reluctantly, without announcement, and then as if they had always known. Martha Delaney stopped asking questions with pointed inflections and started asking questions because she was genuinely curious, which was a different thing entirely. Eleanor Greer and Dorothea Manson became real visitors, not polite ones, and Hannah found herself part of the specific and imperfect community of frontier women who keep things running and rarely get credit for it, which suited her fine because she had never needed the credit, only the work. There were hard days. There were days when the land was punishing and the weather was wrong and something broke that shouldn't have, and everyone was tired and short-tempered and supper was quiet in the bad way. There were days when Elias was impossible to reach, sealed behind the flat expression he put on when something was heavy, and she had to decide again how much space to give him and how much pressure to apply, and sometimes she got that calculation wrong. There were days she missed Ruth so sharply it was physical, and days when the frontier felt so enormous and indifferent that the smallness of a human life against it was almost too much to look at. But there was also this: a man who put fresh coffee on in the mornings, a kitchen that smelled of bread, a garden that had come from ground she'd broken herself, seeds she'd planted in cold earth on the chance they'd take, a house that had learned to hold two lives and was better for the learning. There was this: an evening in late November, the second winter coming on, and the two of them on the porch in the early dark with coffee going cold in their hands, not saying much, just presenting the same space in the way of people who have stopped needing to fill silence and started being able to live inside it together. The land spread out in front of them in the dusk, enormous and indifferent as it always was, and the first stars were coming out above the western edge of the sky. "Cold tonight," he said. "Going to be colder," she said. He reached over and pulled the old red shawl up on her shoulder where it had slipped. She let him. That was all. That was the whole of it. And if you are looking for the lesson in this story, and there is one, though it doesn't announce itself, it is perhaps this: that the things worth having almost never arrive looking like what you expected. They arrive tired, with one suitcase held shut with rope, in a dress 2 seasons out of fashion. They arrive asking practical questions. They turn a stove 6 inches to the left and plant seeds in frozen ground and make molasses cake from a dead woman's recipe and wait, with more patience than anyone should be asked to have, for the people around them to see what was there from the beginning. And the people who do the seeing, who get there eventually, however slowly, however imperfectly, discover that the arriving was the easy part. The staying, the daily choosing, the learning to look at someone clearly instead of looking at what you thought they should be. That is the actual work. It is not glamorous work. It does not make a good speech. But the larkspur comes up blue in June, and the coffee is on at 6, and the house that was hollow learns to hold 2 lives, and that is enough. That is, in fact, everything.